Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It's Tuesday, September 20th, 2011, and our special guest tonight is Bob Gliner. Bob, welcome.
Thanks for having me on your show.
We appreciate your coming on the show. Future of Education is sponsored by Learn Central, part of Blackboard Collaborate, and my Web 2.0 Labs project at web20labs.com. Coming up in November is our first ever Library 2.011, the Future of Libraries Conference. It's 2 days, it's free, it is modeled on the Global Education Conference. It should be a blast. We've got 137 proposals so far. People from 133 countries have signed up for the conference. Really exciting. Also in November, our second Global Education Conference, the 14th to the 18th, 5 days, 24 hours a day. If you missed it last year, please join us. It's really a lot of fun. Coming up on the Future of Education, September 27th, Cecilia de Oliveira on MIT's Open Courseware. On the 29th, a special show about iPads in the classroom. Peter Cookson on the Children's Education Bill of Rights. Timothy Wilson on October 11th, written a book called Redirect that I have just loved on cultural narratives. Personal and cultural narratives, really fascinating. Cognitive psychologist, who I think should be well worth our time. Gina Bianchini of Ming, formerly of Ming, now of Mighty Bell, comes on to talk about her new project. Lee Crockett on his book Literacy is Not Enough. Mark Sermon from Mozilla Foundation on Open Badges on October 20th. Mike Mariner on Road Trip Nation on the 25th of October. Then the two virtual conferences, and Alan Blankstein joins us to talk about improving individual schools. If you've missed one of our shows, they are all up in full recorded versions on futureofeducation.com. We heard from Sam Chaltain last week. There was a problem with the recording software. The recording will come. It's just going to take a little bit longer than usual. But before that, Howard Gardner, The Divorce, Bob Compton, lots of fun. I don't know, Bob Gliner, if you know Bob Compton, but he was just on the show, and I wonder if you do know him.
No, I don't.
Most recently, one called the Finland Phenomenon, and then before that, a couple on they carried the title 2 Million Minutes. Anyway, did you recognize him from that, Bob?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so I'm now going to give you each permission to indicate where you're listening from. Look forward, and then on the left-hand side of the map, you'll see some icons. One is a star or a sun. If you click on that and then click on the map, you can let us know where you're listening from. It's fun to have you shout out in the chat as well. For a small crowd, we're sure geographically diverse tonight. India, New Zealand, Bob, why am I thinking, are you in the Philippines? I'm sorry, Bill Allred. Anyway, well, this is fun to have a small but diverse group wherever you're listening from. Or if you're listening to the recording, we sure appreciate it and are glad you've taken the time. So, Bob, I really appreciate you coming on the show. You sent me 3 films. One was called Education for What? Another was Democracy Left Behind, and the third was Lessons from the Real World. Would you mind sort of putting those in the context of your own career and your interest in education?
Sure. I'm retired now, but I was a longtime sociology professor at San Jose State University in California. And but I also dealt with education and social change, and I've been making documentaries for around 25 years, most of which are on various PBS stations. And I've had a long-time interest in education since I was in graduate school, mostly about what I didn't like about education and how we might be able to change it. So here at San Jose State, I was in sociology, but I directed a number of interdisciplinary projects that focused on how education can impact the surrounding community near San Jose State, and how education, by doing that, how education then engages students more in the learning process. And the three documentaries you mentioned follow along those lines. The first one, Education for What, is about service learning and higher education in metropolitan campuses. So two colleges in the West Coast, two in the Midwest, and two in the East. And it's used at universities across the country to talk about how we can engage students in service learning, which is actually getting students to work on problems in the community and then reflecting on those problems when they come back to the classroom and in the larger curriculum. Democracy Left Behind, I did in 2007, and it's still been airing, and it's also used by various colleges and universities, and that showed how No Child Left Behind has narrowed the curriculum in most public schools to language arts and math, and as a result, we're turning out students who are not very informed about the issues that will dramatically affect their lives, issues that underlie our election campaigns, and so forth. So that's why it's Democracy Left Behind, that we're No Child Left Behind is leaving us with an uninformed group of students and future participants in the election process. And my latest show, Lessons from the Real World, is a follow-up to that, where I focused on schools in Portland, Oregon that weave social issues into the curriculum as a way of engaging students and making learning reading and writing and math and science and all that be more meaningful. It's a type of place-based education focus. So that's a brief summary of those three, and I've been passionate about changing education, and unfortunately, even though there are a lot of isolated instances of very good teaching around place-based education, there's tremendous pressure at the federal level, at the state level, to mostly improve test scores in the abstract of what's going on in students' lives.
Just turn your mic off when you're perfect like that when you're done with that answer, and I'll know to keep going. So we've seen a number of films in the last couple of years, and apart from Waiting for Superman, most of them sort of have limited showings and are often sort of highly personal films. Race to Nowhere, Bob Compton's films, your films, and you probably know of others. Financially, is this hard to do?
Yes, it is actually. I have all my own equipment, and I don't have a background as a filmmaker, but I got involved with a local PBS station that aired a film I did in the early '80s, and I came in as a producer-director, and then I gradually picked up the rest of the skills. And San Jose State University was supportive in getting me equipment to be able to make the films, as well as a local PBS station. So that was very helpful, and sometimes I get hired to do documentaries, and the money I get from that I use to support other projects which I feel need to be made. So Lessons from the Real World, I just felt it needed to be made, and I went out and did it. And So yeah, from a financial standpoint, I don't think, aside from Ken Burns and a few other people, very few people make money from documentary production, but it's usually a, something that they really want to do. They feel they can make a difference. And I quickly discovered that when I did my first film, which was on Soledad Prison here in California in 1984, more people watched that film locally, around 50,000, than there on a local PBS station. That I would have had to write a best-selling book in sociology to equal that number. So I could tell that I could reach a lot more people by doing documentaries, particularly if they aired on television.
So we've talked recently on the show about this sort of intriguingly recursive problem in education, which is if education doesn't help students to become good at thinking about complex problems, then they're not going to be very good as adults in thinking about education. And that maybe there's this cycle that occurs where it's very hard to think of education differently or to think thoughtfully about the ideals or goals of education. Have you noticed this, and does it concern you?
Well, I think what you're talking about is that if parents go through a certain type of educational experience, one that usually isn't very engaging, often they think that's the educational norm, and so it's hard to get them to buy into doing dramatic changes in the school system. But I think my experience, for example, in Portland, Oregon, was there were a lot of parents that wanted to see some changes because they saw the results of their students. They saw students that, when they were engaged in the curriculum and when they were engaged in real problems in the community, that they didn't worry so much about their reading skills and their math skills because those happen naturally. The students learned how to do research because they were researching a real problem, and they had to read about that problem, or they had to do math around analyzing data around a problem. So that concerned the community and concerned the parents, or they had to interview the parents, and then the parents got hooked into the process. So I think you're right that oftentimes people see test scores as the normal judge of what's happening with the school system, but I think there are other possibilities, but unfortunately the national narrative has been going in the opposite direction.
So I want to take that even a little bit deeper, and you can tell me where to stop. But in Education for What, there's a quote that there's a fundamental ambivalence about democracy and our democracy, that we're not comfortable with genuinely democratic ideals because they butt up against the social conformity of commercialism. I think some of those are my words from my notes. But is this kind of part of a deeper issue or problem? Am I reading too much into this, or are we sort of in a very dangerous place of not actually believing that it's important to practice democracy?
Well, I think we are in a very dangerous place. I think just if you follow what's going on, and particularly in the Republican Party debate now, around critical issues facing the country, that it's like we have this pervasive anti-intellectualism in American society, and I think that in a lot of ways public employees and teachers in particular have been denigrated, the kinds of jobs that they do. But I think there's a tendency to want to just have simplistic answers and to very complex questions, and that's one part of it. Excuse me a sec. The other part is that I think one of the things that's happened with democracy in our country is that we, particularly with all the blogs that are out there and so forth, is that everybody thinks everybody's opinion has equal merit and equal value and is equally true. And that's one of the things that's been a problem with discussions about climate change. So even though 99% of the world's scientists think that climate change is caused by human actions, or human actions contribute to climate change, the 1% that disagree with that are given absolutely equal value, and so everybody just throws out all this stuff, and so that's one of the real dangers that I'm seeing now with democracy.
So I'm not sure we necessarily want to get too partisan here, but I'm not sure these are actually new issues either, and I want to ask this question, which is, I feel like we've done the same thing for a long time with prison reform. We've known what works well in terms of reducing recidivism, but it just feels as though our political system as a whole has trouble reaching thoughtful conclusions.
Well, I think you're right about that. I actually, here at San Jose State University, we had a prison program at Soledad Prison that resulted in my first documentary, but we ran a program for 10 years in which a group of 40 people who were incarcerated got bachelor's degrees. And the recidivism rate, which is the rate of return to prison for that group, was 1%. The recidivism rate for the general prison population was 70%. So even though this program showed tremendous merit by educating people who would then not return to prison, the program was killed after 10 years. And so prisons have gone back to actually, particularly because of budget crises, have just gone back to locking people up. And it's cost, obviously, state budgets a tremendous amount of money. So I think you're right. We kind of know what works, and I think in education we also kind of know what works as well. I mean, I believe that place-based education and educating students around issues that are concerned to their lives, the lives of their parents and their communities, makes logical sense, and it makes sense when you actually introduce it in the classroom. But instead of doing that, and instead of using that as a way of motivating students, we turned around and said the best way to teach students is to drill them hour after hour, particularly in low-income neighborhoods or low-income schools, with 3 hours of math, 3 hours of language arts, and hope that they do well on the tests, and so forth.
So let's move into Democracy Left Behind, the next film, chronologically, I think. And you talk about the legacy of No Child Left Behind. And I think you did a nice job of sort of balancing the noble aspirations versus the sort of resulting changes that took place. Do you want to describe kind of the consequence of what you saw from those interviews on the impact of No Child Left Behind?
Well, in Democracy Left Behind, the way that got started was I was teaching a course in the College of Education here, and the students were telling me about their student teaching experiences where they weren't allowed to do anything. The teachers were just teaching to tests, and the students who were in the classroom were just completely turned off. And so I used that as a bridge to do this documentary. And the local dean here, Susan Myers at San Jose State at the time, had done a study of, I think, 900 school districts in which they showed that even in middle-class districts that the curriculum had been dramatically narrowed, and teachers didn't have time to talk about things that were important to them and were important to they thought important to students. And so that's what led me into this kind of critique of K through 12. No Child Left Behind, but I also tried to show that other teachers could do other kinds of things. And so I ended the show with 10 minutes on a small school district outside Boston, Hudson. That's in Massachusetts, where they had weaved social issues from K through 12 all the way through the curriculum, and you had kindergartners talking about quilting projects and all kinds of things that were helping single parent or people that are homeless and so forth, and showed that even kindergartners could understand some of these issues. And then I had another class here in Silicon Valley that where student teachers were doing a consumerism curriculum, and they showed the kindergartners could learn to talk about the difference between needs and wants, and do a whole project around this. And so, which is another aspect of dealing, I think, with education. Oftentimes we think that young students, particularly elementary school students, aren't capable of dealing with social issues, and they're more than capable. They're exposed to those issues every day outside the classroom. And they want to talk about those issues, and they want to feel that they have some power and control over their lives.
It's a great quote, and I think it may actually be in Lessons from the Real World, where one of the educators says, it's really not fair to expect these students to graduate at age 17 or 18 and then to take on the responsibilities of being an adult in the world without having experienced a lot of these issues growing up.
Yeah, I think that was a good quote. That's from a woman who is on the school board in Portland, Oregon, and also teaches at Portland State. And that's true. Oftentimes we think that students will automatically become active participants in a democratic society. Whereas if that was the case, why don't we expect students will automatically learn how to do math and do reading and do science and all these other things? But we focus on reading and math and to some degree science, but we really don't focus on engaging students in what it takes to be an active participant in a democracy. And unless we do that, then what do we expect? We expect them to possibly vote every 2 to 4 years, not be very well informed about issues that underlie election campaigns, probably not run for office. And so how can we have an active democracy with that kind of citizenry?
There's a very well-spoken superintendent, I think, from the Hudson District, who says that the purpose of public schools is to create a public in which a democracy can thrive. I really liked sort of the straightforwardness of having a definition of education. Is that a definition you agree with, and do you think that that's broadly held?
I think I agree with that definition, but I don't know that it's broadly held. I think, unfortunately, I think schools have become totally wrapped up in just achieving high test scores rather than looking at the bigger picture of what are we preparing students to become. And what kinds of citizens are we preparing and them to become, and what kind of society do we want them to occupy, and how do we expect them to help change that society or to improve that society? So instead we become, we're comparing ourselves to other countries based on test scores and so forth. And I think that test scores would happen would rise automatically, actually, if students were engaged in the learning process. That if they were really engaged in the issues that concern their lives, that concern the society, that they thought were important, then they would become motivated to do the things that would actually probably increase test scores. Instead, we reversed that whole equation and we said, let's just focus on increasing test scores in the abstract and not think about the larger consequences. So if we really want an informed public, then we need to spend some time and energy in the classroom creating that informed public. But again, both the Bush administrations and the Obama administration, unfortunately, seems to have been taking that in the opposite direction. On the other hand, we could say that we don't want an informed public, because if we had an informed public, we probably wouldn't have the types of candidates running for public office we now do. Maybe we'd have a more critical society, and we'd have to make some serious changes.
Yeah, as I watched your films, I did ask myself the question: this purpose of public schools, creating a public in which democracy can thrive. I've wondered, was there actually a point in American education when that was the stated perspective of the majority, or is this always been sort of the minority position, but a more thoughtful one?
I think it's actually always been, I mean, I'm not an education historian, but I think it's been the minority position. Thinking back to when I was in school, in elementary school in the 50s, in Southern California, we used to have, the only times we focused on issues was when we'd have a nuclear attack, and we'd have to pretend nuclear attack. They'd throw an alarm, and everybody would go into their desks, and then they'd ring the all clear, and everybody would come out as if we could survive a nuclear attack on Los Angeles. So I think John Dewey obviously wrote about this kind of stuff, and other people have over the years, but I think the main purpose of public education was never to actually create an informed public. I think the general purpose was to create workers that were capable of reading labels and educated enough to contribute to the economy. I don't think we're worried so much about having an informed electorate in terms of having an active democratic society.
So your films really focus on specific schools and specific programs that you feel are doing a really good job in some way. Has that led you to any sense of kind of larger policy decisions when you think about education from a policy level? Have you come to any conclusions about what we might do to increase that opportunity for these kinds of schools and activities to thrive?
Well, public policy is difficult to change, but I think that I had toyed with an idea here. First, I was sarcastic about it, but then I actually thought maybe here at San Jose State we ought to have a political literacy test to graduate from the university, and which people actually showed that they understood some of the underlying issues that underlie American society as well as the world, America's place in the world. But I think in terms of changing public policy, we would have to create a whole new way or a different way of evaluating students, and I think there is some move in that direction to among some people to shift from to a portfolio evaluations and other ways of evaluating students rather than straight out tests. But I think a lot of elected officials, unfortunately, have come out of probably the same public schools or private schools as are causing the problem in the first place. And so to get them on board would take a tremendous amount of effort. And there are people lobbying for those kinds of efforts, such as people in the Rethinking Schools movement and so forth. But they're distinctly in the minority. One other aspect of all of this, however, is there's a huge number of teachers in the United States, and they have a lot of potential power, especially if they're aligned with parents and various community members. It's just figuring out a way of articulating, a vision that makes sense to everybody in order to get policymakers to listen.
I think for me, one of the most intriguing aspects of our current moment in time is the degree to which social media is allowing educators to form their own kind of political voices. in a way that's not dissimilar, say, from what's happening in Egypt or and countries where the question is governance, but here the conversation we're having is education. And that intrigues me because I think it actually is going on a little.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there are discussions in social media. I'm not as active in social media networking as many other people, but yeah, I think that probably gives some hope. I think what needs to happen if we really want a fundamental change is that we need to first off probably change a lot of our colleges of education so that students are educated in a way that when they become teachers that they see the importance of creating informed citizens as part of the an important part of the curriculum, and then they in turn will then educate people who have become parents who will be concerned about those issues as well. And many of those people are connected on social media sites, but I'm not. Since I don't follow a lot of social media sites on an active basis, I probably couldn't comment too much on that.
It's a little bit of a double-edged sword. You've identified that one of the things social media does is it magnifies all kinds of voices. At the same time, it does allow for conversations that previously couldn't take place. Have you ever visited a democratic school?
Yeah, actually, there's a school that I filmed on my latest show, Lessons from the Real World, where the students had a lot of say in how the school could be run. And I filmed one of their, they had an all-school meeting in which the students were able to voice concerns. The school also had its own judiciary system, and in which students were able to bring problems and grievances and discuss what the remedies should be. So I think those kinds of schools are very important to giving students a voice, and at the same time, however, they take away from other kinds of activities that oftentimes schools think are a higher priority. So you have to trade off. Do we want to spend time doing democratic education in that way, teaching students how to articulate points of view, teaching at the time of compromising and debating, or do we want to just focus again on preparing students to take tests? So that's difficult. The second aspect is, I think that schools have had to wrestle with is how do you evaluate students who have participated in the democratic educational system. But most places, and it's not just K-12 education, higher education itself is not a very democratic institution. So even though we have academic senates and faculty, groups that represent faculty, and we have student government, usually the day-to-day operation of a university is not particularly democratic. Faculty have control over their own classrooms, typically, but the whole place is not usually run as a democracy.
Yeah, which does lead to a very interesting set of questions about sort of the outcome or consequence of that form of education. So there may be, say, a cascading set of expectations from a business, then to graduate school, then to university or college, then to high school. So it would be very hard to measure the outcomes of alternative education or progressive education, democratic education. Have you come across anything where the students themselves who've gone through these kind of educational, place-based education or educational systems have said, I would never go anywhere else, or this is what I want for my kids? Is it that clear-cut?
I haven't. Usually when I interview students, I haven't interviewed parents who've gone through all that. But I think the students who've gone through those programs clearly say, or students who have transferred, I have interviewed students who have transferred from a traditional school to a more progressive school, and they clearly favor the more progressive school, and they say they wouldn't go back to the other kind of school environment. Here at San Jose State, when I've headed up interdisciplinary classes and students inadvertently ended up in those projects where we combine 3 or 4 classes focusing on from different disciplines, focusing on one problem in the community. Students who would never have taken those under normal circumstances, once they enrolled and got involved, they said, oh, we're really glad we took, I'd say 90% said we're really glad we got involved with this. It's really changed our perspective on education, changed our perspective on dealing with social issues as part of our educational experience.
So, in Democracy Left Behind, at some point somebody uses the phrase love of learning. And I was kind of shocked. I sat up and thought, wow, in all of these conversations, how rarely that phrase comes up, but how important it seems to be. Did that strike you as well? Do you remember the scene?
I actually don't remember the scene exactly, but a lot of I think a lot of students that I have filmed in all 3 of these documentaries have evidence that they have a love of learning, and you can just feel you get that sense almost immediately when you walk into a particular classroom or a particular school where this kind of education goes on, that they're actively engaged, that they feel that it makes a difference whether they're in school or not. I think students at most schools don't feel it really makes a difference to the larger society whether they're in school or not. And they don't feel it makes a difference in their lives. The school wants them there because they'll lose money if the students stop attending or their test scores will go down. But I think most students don't feel that, hey, I have to really be at school today because otherwise our society is going to be affected, or otherwise my community is going to be affected, or otherwise my fellow students are going to be affected, and my parents' lives are going to be affected. And the future of the world is going to be affected. So I think if we were able to create an educational system where students actually said, hey, this is my job, my parents go to their job, my thing is actually going here to school because it makes a difference in everybody's life, including my own.
So let's move to lessons from the real world. Would you like, I can actually pull up the page that has the clip and we could watch the 30-second clip. Why don't I do that? So I'm going to set that up right now. A web page will come up for you in the audience, and you'll see a place middle right hand of your screen. Go ahead and click the play button. We'll play the trailer for that movie. We'll have you come back in about 30 seconds. Okay, so hopefully you were able to see that. If for some reason it was slow for you, it didn't come up, I'm putting the link in the chat. You can watch it afterwards. So, Bob, tell us a little bit about the schools here and the kinds of activities that you profile.
Well, these particular schools, there's a wide range. Several of the schools are in low-income areas of Portland, Oregon. But all the schools are in Portland, Oregon. And but what the schools all have in common is, or what the classes that I profiled have in common is that they engage students in issues of concern to the local community or to the nation. So, for example, at one of the high schools, you have students doing what I guess is commonly referred to as student voice. That is, they had to write in an English class, a 10th grade English class, they had to write poems about their lives, and then talk those poems out and onto a fake microphone that was on a stage or a platform in front of the classroom. And they actually talk about some very personal things about some of the about family issues, family problems, community problems, and so forth. So it's giving students a chance to voice things that are vital concern to their lives at the same time as they're in an English class learning how to write and read, and so forth. So I think that's very important, and students clearly got a lot out of that student voice project, and it's also was a really good way to teach English. So that's a classroom level. On the other hand, there's a school, the only actual, well, then there's another school, Sunnyside Environmental School, which is a K through 8 public school. In fact, they're all public schools. And at that school, they focus on the environment, but the environment is broadly determined. So the environment is not just the physical environment, but it's the social environment, the philosophical environment, the political environment. And so I focused on two groups of students. One is 2 third-grade classes that developed a project. Oregon wants to get more people riding their bicycles as a way of reducing pollution and using less energy in the city. So the third graders, after electing their own city council in the classroom and debating various kinds of things, went out and interviewed people and did a survey to support the actual Oregon City Council around this issue of getting more people to ride bikes. And so I filmed them, I think they're around 8 years old, out interviewing people on one of the busier streets in Portland, and then analyzing the results on computers, tallying the results, and then ultimately they presented them, communicated them to the City Council in Portland. And then I also filmed the middle school class at also at Sunnyside Environmental School that did such projects as they were always out in the community, it seemed. They were supposed to pilot working at the Oregon Food Bank, bagging food for low-income families. They did several walking tours and streetcar tours of downtown Portland, and then they were asked to draw up their conception of what Portland should look like, or what an ideal city block would look like, what a park would look like. Almost like an urban planner would, and then they went back to the classroom and analyzed that kind of thing. So that was an interesting kind of school, and they had also, I didn't put it in the show, but they all school assemblies and so forth where they debated various issues. Another school that I dealt with, the only charter school, which is a public charter school, Trillium Charter in Portland. It's in a kind of a rundown building, but the vibes in there were fantastic. And there I filmed a combination class, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade class that had developed a seed company to raise money to rebuild their, that was kind of a rundown outer space around the school that they wanted to make with cob walls and fix into like a park area that the whole school could use. And so they developed a seed company, and they had to figure out where to get the seeds, package the seeds, and then I filmed them going to the local markets to set up stands where they could sell the seeds, pitching their stuff, and they developed such things as video displays in order to show people how to sell seeds, their fellow students how to sell seeds. They had to write analysis of what they were doing. They had to do math to calculate how much money they were making or losing, and so forth. The same school, it was a K through 12, so they also had they did role playing around the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, in which people had to take different stands on on that conflict, and it was a wide range of positions, and as a way of putting themselves in somebody else's shoes and analyzing a complex event that's going on in the world right now. And the same way you might analyze any kind of complex event, whether it's health issues, environmental issues, and so forth. And unfortunately, again, if we think about how complex events are often being debated today in the press and by politicians, this is the complete opposite to that. Another school that I focused on was a place called Atkinson Elementary, another public school where they taught 4 languages. Let's say Vietnamese, Chinese, Spanish, and actually English, 3 languages in English. And but what made the school unique was not only the languages and the music aspects and the culture that flowed from those, but also they had a garden, a multicultural garden, and each cultural group had their own piece of the garden. So they grew vegetables that were germane to Vietnamese cuisine or Chinese cuisine or Spanish, Mexican food and so forth. So, and then often the surplus food was given away to the parents who might need the food at the end of the growing season. So what they were able to do is it was an interdisciplinary curriculum, which I think is very important, and they were able to weave math, science, foreign language, music, and so forth into this living garden that was the school surrounded the garden. And I thought that was a fairly meaningful experience that a lot of schools can engage in terms of gardens. Another school I focused on was a public school in a suburb just out in Milwaukee, just out part of Portland, and that actually opens the show. And their 6th grade students wrote their own music that had to reflect an environmental project they were involved with. So they were involved in a project to help save a wetland, and they measured how invasive species grew up in the wetland, and so they were able to apply math and science principles to that. They analyzed pollution in streams in the wetland, but then they also took pictures of plants and so forth in the wetland and trees in the wetland, and they had to write music compositions around things like photosynthesis and what that all meant to them, and then they performed the music. And I actually used that music to weave through the whole show. They also had to write poetry around what they felt in the wetlands. They wrote, they did journaling around that as well. So they did math, writing. They did art projects around what they did in the wetlands. So it was a completely interdisciplinary 6th grade educational experience. And so students coming out of that then would have an interdisciplinary analysis of how the world works, which I think is another important aspect that's being lost in No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top educational policy, which is when a student steps outside the classroom, most problems present themselves in an interdisciplinary fashion. They don't present themselves as this is a math problem, this is an English problem, this is a science problem, this is a biology problem, but it's an interdisciplinary thing, and the best way to solve it is to think in an interdisciplinary way. How can I take all the tools from all these different disciplines and apply them to solving that problem? And I think some of the schools I focused on that were effective tried to do this, that is to teach things so that you could see how each dovetails into the other, and that's really a more accurate way of approaching problem solving. Unfortunately, not only K through 12, but universities themselves often compartmentalize curriculum into very specific aspects, and the students don't get that kind of experience. And I think when they don't, then they have to somehow automatically figure out when they get they graduate high school or elementary school or middle school or college, how do I tie all those different pieces of the curriculum together on my own?
So there was something about each of those projects that intrigued me, and we'll get to that in a minute. But as a larger picture, I think the most intriguing aspect of all of them put together was that they all seem sort of radically different from this portrayal of the results of No Child Left Behind. So how are these schools doing this? Who's supporting them, or how are they bucking the trend? How are they able to maintain this kind of an education as public schools with expectations that other schools are buckling under?
Well, I should say that not every school in Portland, Oregon is like this. But there's one of the things that is supportive of the school district there. There are two things. One is that you have a large number of teachers that meet regularly, that support each other, that mentor each other, and so if a teacher is isolated at a particular school, they can get support from other teachers, or they can get ideas of how to weave these things through their classroom or their curriculum. So I think it's important to have a network of teachers, particularly in an environment like this where there's tremendous pressure on teachers just to teach to the test. And not all cities have that. But it could be created in almost any city. It's just that it happened to take place in Portland, and that's what enabled me to actually get into a lot of these classrooms very quickly. And the second thing that I think is typical of most all these schools is there's a lot of parental involvement. So parents want to see Portland's a fairly progressive city, and I think a lot of parents would like to see their students learning other things besides teaching to the test. They want to see their kids come home excited about what they've learned in the classroom. And so you see quite a few parent volunteers at the schools, not all the schools, but at the elementary school level, I think there's a lot of, the ones I focused on there's a lot of parental support. That doesn't mean parents were there all the time, but they had a strong parent groups and so forth. On the other hand, there's countervailing state pressures in Oregon and particularly in California and all across the country that go in the opposite direction. But I think the particular schools I focused on, that you had, again, mentor teachers, you had a strong teacher support network, you had a parent support network that seemed to make these schools stand out and these schools work.
You know, that's a really good description, and I'm still left wondering, is there a principal there who's taking the heat? You know, is there, or a school board, in the administrative positions, are they getting support that maybe other schools aren't?
Well, I think in some cases the principals are under a lot of fire. So it's not always that the larger Board of Education is always supportive of these types of educational programs, but the principals either had enough security or enough other kinds of support that they're able to withstand that, or enough popularity to withstand that. I think you raised a good point, which is that it's not only the teachers and the parents, but usually what drives this is a strong principal. That is, a principal that is willing to take the heat, that says what we're doing is not working, or a strong superintendent of schools who says we want to do something different. In Hudson, Sheldon Berman, who was the superintendent at that time, he went on to Louisville, and I think now he's in Eugene, Oregon. But he clearly believed in, he was one of the founders of Educators for Social Responsibility, and he clearly believed that we had to do something differently, or his school district had to do something differently, and I think he clearly drove that discussion and clearly drove the curriculum. So it is important to have a strong leadership, and I think that's particularly the case. My earlier film on education for one service learning, Portland State University is probably the leading service learning university in the country. They require virtually all of their students to do 2 quarters of service learning in the community, working on community problems from an interdisciplinary perspective, and that's why I originally went to Portland in 2003 and to film their activities. But that was driven by a strong provost and a strong president, university president, who were able to bring the faculty on board and say, this is something we really want to do. On the other hand, there's plenty of universities and colleges where service learning isn't a top priority, and there's plenty of public schools where this type of education is not a strong priority either, and I think in those cases, superintendents and principals can impede that process.
There was, in the vignette on the student selling the seeds and the teacher, I think it's the teacher of that class who says at one point that he thinks his students' scores are actually higher than other students who weren't doing that kind of engaged activity. Do you think that's measurable?
I asked virtually all the teachers that I interviewed about test scores, and most of them said they were either comparable or higher than students during regular classes. And I think it is measurable. You could just give students a traditional math test or a language arts test and compare the results. But I think the more important thing is that not only are students motivated to do math and reading at or above the level of other students, but they're learning other things as well. I mean, other things that are certainly of equal validity in their lives, and that will underlie their motivation to do more reading or higher level math and so forth. And so it's those other things that I think we should be focusing on. What are students actually getting out of their education? It's not just higher test scores to have higher test scores. It's what kind of society we're going to have. But I think the important point there is that instead of worrying so much about if students are doing equal or above on math and reading, what are the other things that they're actually learning from the educational system? Are they learning just that education is really boring, or are they learning that education can really make a difference in the society and in our lives? And we're learning all these other things as well. We're learning how the political system works. We're learning how to bring about social change. We're learning how different disciplines weave together to get a better analysis or a more accurate analysis of what's going on in the world. So I think those are the things that we should think about. How do we evaluate those things? And I think they're often evaluated by what the students end up doing with their lives.
So we've got about 10 minutes to go. I have a couple more questions, but I want to make sure that if anybody from the audience has a question, that they ask it. Carolyn does ask whether or not she's thinking about a place to aggregate all these great examples to potentially allow for emulation and then innovation, sort of a clearinghouse of these kinds of activities. And she's wondering if it has to be either or. Couldn't these projects be blended into traditional learning as well?
Well, I think traditional learning does go on, and I think traditional learning does take place within the context of these projects. I mean, if the students want to improve some aspect of the community and they end up reading about that aspect, and then they have to learn how to read in order to do that, or they have to do math around that, or they have to learn certain science principles, the basic level, the further advanced that goes, and the more they have to learn about those things. So I think that's a traditional context. And I should emphasize, I think this came out in Lessons from the Real World, that it takes a certain type of teacher to really to deal with this kind of educational experience. One good teacher at Sunnyside Environmental School, third grade teacher, pointed out that if you're the kind of teacher that, or like a lot of districts are now, everybody in the district's on the same page at the same hour at the same time, this type of curriculum is not going to work because for them. Because often you have to be flexible, you have to give students a certain amount of control. On the other hand, you have to kind of guide where the students are going. And so it takes a kind of a flexible teacher. So that raises the question of what type of college of education is going to promote that kind of teaching. And second of all, how do we actually get teachers that feel secure in their own political experience to be able to act as mentors for their students? In other words, we need teachers that themselves analyze the world in an interdisciplinary fashion, teachers that also are actively engaged in the political process. And so I think it all kind of weaves together. You can't just take teachers that are have been educated in a traditional format and say go out and do this kind of a different type of education. It just doesn't work.
We've talked a lot on the show about the sort of cultural narratives around education, and for me, the intriguing story of Finland really is how did they align themselves together around an idea that trusted educators? What was the process? Who were the people involved that were able to communicate well enough that the culture itself aligned around a new narrative of education? And it seems like that's sort of what you're saying, which is we have a lot of different voices and that would have to come together to agree to make this the majority and not the minority story.
Well, I totally agree with you. I think there's teachers all over the country that probably agree with some of what we've talked about and are engaged in some of these activities, but often in isolation from each other. And so there has to be a way of networking them. I think Rethinking Schools magazine and the organization tries to do that, and there's some other organizations that try to do that. But again, it's just it's a small group out of a very large number. So the question is how do we build that kind of narrative? How do we support teachers? And unfortunately, given what happened in Wisconsin and so forth, that a lot of teachers are under fire, and a lot of teachers feel insecure about their jobs. A lot of teachers have lost their jobs. And so in that kind of environment, it becomes difficult to say, well, how do I go out and engage in something that looks like progressive education or alternative education? I'm just trying to hold on to my teaching position. And same for new teachers coming out. How are they going to go out and do this kind of thing in the context of, I got to hold on to my job, or I have to try and get a tenured position and so forth. So it makes it hard, but I think it's important, and I think there's a lot of underlying energy there to want to do this. There's one of the things that No Child Left Behind, I think Race to the Top will demonstrate, is that there's tremendous teacher burnout. That teachers are leaving the profession in large numbers, that because they don't feel they have any control over their classrooms anymore, and they're not engaged in the kind of education that maybe they thought they would be engaged in. So I think there's a lot of potential to create a political movement around changing the curriculum, and not just a political movement, but as you pointed out, a new narrative around what education should be. But again, the press seems to be constantly dominated by, these are the test scores of these schools, and they publish them in all the papers, and that's what they seem to be focused on. But so the narrative has to be driven in another direction. That's actually why I did both No Child Left, the Democracy Left Behind, and Lessons from the Real World, And I've tried to get it on as many PBS stations as possible to, try and raise people's awareness of what might be the possibilities of public education.
Turn your mic off there. You don't talk about the media, or at least I don't remember that you did. I'm sort of increasingly wondering about the sort of social conformity of commercialism and the degree to which the media is driven by commercial entities. What role do you see the media playing in our thinking about education?
Well, potentially, the media could play a great role. I mean, it would be great to have a couple of not just sitcoms, but dramas, weekly dramas on television about teachers doing this, experimenting with different types of education, just to getting people talking about that. I always thought there should be a show around community organizing, and a whole wide range of shows like that for training even state legislator, where you could have some serious drama, you could have some romance, and so forth, but they would be actually dealing with real issues, trying to solve real problems in the society, and so people would see role models for that in terms of regular television. PBS, where on PBS stations where I try and get most of my material. Again, most PBS stations don't air that many documentaries, and so maybe what we need is some sort of educational network where documentaries and talk shows and other kinds of things could go on 24 hours a day around. This is what I've tried in my classroom. This is how we can make a difference, and then people could tune into that. And I would, or through YouTube, or something like that, or through what you're doing.
So we've just got a couple minutes left. One question in the chat was, what do you think about the Common Core standards?
Well, on the one hand, I guess I'm somewhat supportive that we ought to have some sort of national standards. On the other hand, I think the way they're articulated has to come through local issues and again, place-based education. So I think they wanted to create national standards because they felt some school districts were falling way behind, which is why No Child Left Behind, the motivation for creating the No Child Left Behind legislation. But I think what has happened as a result of that often is that the Common Core standards have become this excuse to standardize the whole curriculum and take away local control of a lot of the schools, and so then teachers lose local control over their classrooms, and they're not able to focus on issues that are germane to their students. So I think if we kept in mind in the background that we need a common educational experience in terms of everybody needs to learn certain basic things, but how do we do that? How do we articulate it? And then what does that actually mean? Maybe there ought to be also a Common Core standard again around political literacy.
Because we're minutes away from finishing, I wanted to get to another quick question. Carolyn's asking if any of your films are available online in the streaming version or through PBS.
My films are sold through various distributors, and they're all, if you go on my website, each of the films connects with the relevant distributor. For a while I sold each show off my website, but then I just did that for the first 6 months, but now they're all national distribution. So if anybody wants one, or you want your school district to have one, if they're too expensive, then you can order them through the distributors. Both Democracy Left Behind and Lessons from the Real World are distributed by Films for the Humanities and Sciences, which is the largest distributor of documentaries in the country. And probably in the world actually. And I think they stream them, and or you can just if you're in a school district or a college campus, you're able to access them without paying a huge amount of money. So anyhow, if you go on my website, docmakeronline.com, I think you can gain access to those. The Lessons from the Real World has been airing the last 7 months on various PBS stations, and it seems to be continuing to air and on a lot of stations prime time, such as in Chicago. Anyhow, it's aired in about 60% of the market.
So if someone searches, they might be able to find it broadcasting currently in their local area.
Yeah, they can find it, or they can call their local PBS station, who they all have access to it, and ask them to either repeat it or play it. Tell them it was just, and if they do that, they can just say it was distributed by NETA, which is one of the groups that feeds to PBS stations nationwide, NETA.
Bob, we've reached the top of the hour. I want to thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your work and your being willing to do this interview.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
Our pleasure. If you want to clap for Bob, look for the smiley face icon in the practice room window and then go down to applause. I wish that were its own icon button. That's going to be my next suggestion. But anyway, terrific having Bob Gliner on the show tonight. Coming up next week, Cecilia D'Olivero on OpenCourseWare, and Bruce Umstead, Ashley McDonald, Allison Rockwell, Tom Johnson, and Amber Kowach on iPads in the classroom. And lots more coming up. Thanks again, Bob. Terrific to have you on.
Thank you, and good luck.
Appreciate it. Appreciate you getting to San Jose State to make sure everything went well. Okay, folks, thanks for joining us. I will pause the recording at this point, and then do need you to exit the room for the recording to process. Thanks for joining us, and talk to you next time.